My name's Pete Woods. You're watching Hexham TV. Who are you?
Hi, I'm Brian Groom. I'm author of a new book called Northerners: A History. This book from the Northerners: A History from the Ice Age to the present day.
So tell me a little bit about yourself, Brian.
Right, I'm a journalist, and I spent 40 years, a lot of it writing about and covering British and regional affairs. And as a kid, I was absolutely history mad. And I've come back to that again as I've been a bit older. So those two things kind of came together in my mind, and I thought history of the North, really interesting subject. I couldn't wish for a better subject to write about. And I was astonished to discover it's only ever been done once before. There's only been one general history of Northern England published, and that was in 1990. It seemed like a big gap and an opportunity.
Perhaps that tells us something, Brian. I don't know what, but certainly a gap in the market there, which you've very cleverly and successfully filled. Where does the North begin and end?
People ask me that. Two questions people often ask me: where is the North, and what is a Northerner? And the answer is I don't have to issue passports, so I can afford to take a liberal and inclusive view of what a Northerner is. So in my definition in the book, the North is where the people who live in a place think they're in the North, and a Northerner is somebody who thinks of themselves as a Northerner. If you look at it, it's a cultural question. It's not been a single government region since the Kingdom of Northumbria in Anglo-Saxon times. So, and the Scottish border was largely fixed in 1237. There's sea down two sides. There is a lot of debate about where the southern border lands, but as I say, I leave it up to the people. And in the book, if anything interesting happens in the grey area, I just tend to put it in.
That's very diplomatic of you, Brian. You've been a journalist on some really esteemed publications, Brian, over the years. How do you think the North is viewed by others?
Yeah, I mean, I spent most of my career at the Financial Times working in London, and I worked in Scotland for 10 years. I launched and edited Scotland on Sunday. So I've seen it from a few different viewpoints. I mean, the relationship between Northerners and Southerners is kind of, it's been, a lot of the time it's at banter level, and sometimes it's more antagonistic, but it's been, the perceived difference has been there for centuries, and I guess has mainly to do with being distant from the center of power and people creating their own identity and their own image. I'm going to read you a little list of Northern characteristics as perceived by Northerners, and Northern characteristics as perceived by outsiders, mainly Southerners. This came from an earlier book by a chap called Dave Russell called Looking North. And the Northern self-image, he listed independent, blunt and straight talking, hardworking and physically tough, competitive, practical and productive, careful with money, friendly and hospitable, proud of roots and identity, meritocratic and egalitarian, knowledgeable, holding strong views, humorous and witty. But the same characteristics as perceived outside were truculent, carrying chip on shoulder, rude, lacking social graces, hardworking, overcompetitive, ungentlemanly, philistine, unpolished, albeit highly musical, mean, homely, parochial, working class, prejudiced, humorous if crude. Now, to some extent, those are two sides of the same coin. And I think the North has, one thing I don't do in the books, I don't try to define the characteristics of a Northerner, because it suffered a lot from stereotypes. Not because it's not possible, but I think in reality, it's multi-layered and quite a lot subtler than people give it credit for.
And your book covers both people and events. How did you decide what to put in and what to leave out?
Very difficult. I mean, the idea was to sort of loosely follow the timeline and do lots of social and cultural issues as I was going along. In the end, there's more narrative history than I probably intended, and that's simply because there's lots of it, and it's absolutely fascinating. It does have a very, very strong story to tell. So the Northerners I include are really driven by the story. I tackle them as they come up and as they're important. I did have a little think at the end and think, is there anybody important I've missed out here? And I'm sure there is, but I immediately thought of Captain Cook, so I went back and put a bit about him in there.
And having written the book, what has it told you about the North? What have you learned about the North that perhaps you didn't know?
Well, it's probably, I mean, there are some specific things. It's probably just getting greater depth on places I knew a bit about, so I know quite a lot more. And also going around the North giving talks on the book, it means I kind of add in quite a bit of local information, so I learn a fair bit about more about places wherever I go. But one thing that helped me a bit, I think, was when I was a kid. My father was a sales manager at a small cotton textiles firm, a wholesaler. And at half terms, he used to take me with him on his sales trips around the North. So I went to lots of I got a picture of what the place looked like quite early on, and the variety in it and the level of interest in it.
So you grew up in the North. What was your experience, personal experience of growing up in the North at a particular period in time, and how perhaps how different was that than someone who might have grown up in the South at that time?
Well, I like most of my generation, I feel very lucky to have been brought up just after the Second World War and in an era of rapidly expanding prosperity and increased opportunities for education and things like that. And the North has shared in those things. It also did share in post-war prosperity, but it's at the same time, its industries were becoming inexorably less competitive. And a lot of places were in severe decline by the 1970s and 1980s. There's been some turnaround since then, particularly in the big cities and some of the more prosperous county towns. But there are big problem areas still, places like the former mill towns, the coal fields and seaside towns. And I guess that whole process would have been quite different to somebody being brought up in the South over these periods.
And do you think that rural areas in the North have suffered as well from?
Yeah, people think of the North as, because its image from the Industrial Revolution is so powerful, people think of the North as a working class place with mills and factories and things. That's the whole image of it. But for most of history, it's been and is now predominantly agricultural, and that has driven its history in a big way. The whole climate and geology of the North has been a fascinating story. People sometimes divide England by what they call a Jurassic divide. There's a ridge of Jurassic limestone that runs from the Dorset coast in the southwest up to Yorkshire, and north and west of it, you tend to get highland zone, harder rocks, an economy based on a pastoral economy raised on raising sheep and things like that. And to the south and east of it, you got richer farmland, and you tend to get villages forming, things like that. So it was a disadvantage through most, if it's an oversimplification, you've got areas, arable areas like the Northumberland Plain, for example. But it's probably broadly true, and this disadvantage went into reverse in the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly, the geographical factors that were holding the North back became advantages, or the water for streams, the wet climate, damp climate for the cotton and wool and things like that, and lots of sources of coal and iron and chemicals. So it helped. So the North is it's a huge place. Its economy is bigger than Denmark, Sweden, Argentina, wherever. It's a huge place. Its economy is very varied, and it's still a very big and important agricultural region.
As someone who's studied regional policy over the years, Brian, are you optimistic for the North's future?
I always try to be optimistic and look for the good signs. You have to say you have to be realistic as well. Say in the book, the North's share of Britain's economic output has shrunk from 30% just after the First World War to about 20% now. And there have been efforts to close the divide since the late 1920s, and there have been repeated ones, and they tended to be half-hearted and inconsistent. And when a government changes, the new lot throw out whatever the last lot were doing. And it even happens within governments of the same party when the prime minister changes. So under the present government, we've had David Cameron's rebalancing, remember that? Then we had the Northern Powerhouse, which had a bit more substance. And then now we've got Boris Johnson's levelling up, and we're still waiting to see what that means really in practice.
What do you think the government can do to allow the North to make the most of the advantages that it has in the future?
Looking at the optimistic side, the one big plus over the last few decades, I think, has been the revival of the big cities, including Newcastle. I wouldn't have necessarily predicted that in the early 1980s. The cities were in a dire shape, as they were in many parts of the world. And the elements that have helped to drive that recovery include a partnership between the local politicians and local businesses, and also an element of cooperation with central government. And I think all successful regeneration efforts around the world need those three elements to succeed. The solutions may be different in different types of towns or rural areas or whatever, but without those kind of basic building blocks, I don't think you'd get very far. The most successful regeneration effort we've seen, the developed world has seen in modern times, is the revival of East Germany, the former East Germany. But that's involved huge government money, big schemes, and also importantly, cross-party support. They were designed to last for decades. That's something we've really lacked in Britain, I think.
And if you were to look at all the people that you've mentioned in your book, is there one Northerner that stands out for you, Brian?
Yes, I mean, I try not to have a favourite Northerner, because it's a bit like deciding which of your children you're going to favour. But if I'm pushed, I think the one I found most fascinating was Josephine Butler, a 19th century reformer from Northumberland. She, through a personal tragedy, turned into a reformer and had some amazing success. She's a very brave woman. She ended coverture, which is whereby a woman's legal rights were subsumed by her husband's on marriage. And she also exposed and succeeded in criminalizing child prostitution and human trafficking. And I think we owe a lot to her.
Brian, this is your first book. Is there going to be a second?
Hopefully, yes. I'm supposed to be working on ideas for it now, but it's been so busy I've not really got round to it. As I say, I'm doing this book tour. I should mention for any of your viewers and listeners that on Friday, May the 27th, I'll be at Waterstones in Hexham signing a few copies at about 11 o'clock in the morning for an hour or so. So any of you around and want me to sign a book or have a chat, do drop along then.